Today, we're really diving deep into some dense philosophical waters. We're taking on The Varieties of Reference by Gareth Evans.
It's definitely a challenging read, but like you said, it's really thought-provoking. There's a lot to unpack.
For sure. And I think one of the most striking things, at least from my reading, it seems like Evans is rejecting this idea of a single theory of reference, like a one-size-fits-all explanation of how language refers.
Absolutely. He's really pushing back against the traditional view that there's this single essential theory that can count for every way we use language to talk about the world. Instead, Evans argues that we need to recognize the diversity of reference, hence the title.
So it's not about finding this like universal essence of reference, but more about recognizing the nuances and differences in how different expressions function.
He's encouraging us to move away from the search for a single answer and instead embrace the idea that there are varieties of reference, each with its own unique characteristics.
That's a pretty significant shift, isn't it? I mean, if you think about how reference has been traditionally viewed in philosophy, it seems like there's been this ongoing quest for a unified theory.
Absolutely. Traditionally, philosophers have sought a single, like I said, the essential theory of reference, this overarching explanation for how all referring expressions work. But Evans comes in and says, hold on, I think that's too simplistic.
So rather than trying to fit everything into a single box, Evans wants us to appreciate these subtle differences.
Precisely. He wants us to acknowledge that some referring expressions work in one way and others work in a completely different way. And that's okay. There's no need to force them all into the same mold.
So what exactly makes Evans' approach to reference unique?
Well, for Evans, reference involves a dynamic interplay between our mental representations, information flow, and those shared linguistic practices.
Okay, so it's more than just labeling things. Can you elaborate on what Evans means by these terms like mental representations and this information flow?
Certainly. Evans suggests that when we refer to something, we aren't just retrieving like a static label from our mental lexicon, but instead we are activating a whole complex web of information, perceptions, and even imaginative constructs. And this information is constantly being updated and refined through our interactions both with the world and with other language users.
So you're saying our understanding of a word or concept is like constantly evolving.
Exactly. And this evolution is shaped not only by our individual experiences, but also by the social practices and conventions of our linguistic community. Evans emphasizes that language is not a private affair. Instead, it's a shared system that enables us to coordinate our thoughts and our actions.
Can you maybe give us an example of how this information flow works in practice?
Sure. Let's say we're discussing a recent news event. We might both use the same words to refer to the people involved. However, our understanding of these people will be shaped by the specific information each of us has encountered. Maybe you read in-depth profiles while I've only seen a few headlines. Therefore, our mental representations of these individuals will differ in certain ways while also sharing some common ground.
But we're still able to communicate.
Yes, because our shared language provides a framework for understanding even when our internal understandings might differ. We can still connect through the shared conventions of language.
Evans argues that these shared conventions, which he calls linguistic practices, are crucial in establishing and maintaining reference. These practices give us a foundation for mutual intelligibility. So this highlights the social dimension of language, right?
Absolutely. Evans argues that language isn't just a tool for individual thought, but it's also a social institution that shapes our collective understanding of the world. For him, meaning is not something that is inherent in words themselves, but arises from how we use them in communication with each other. To truly understand reference, we have to consider not only the relationship between words and objects, but also this intricate web of social interactions and shared understandings.
That makes sense. This makes me think about, the classic distinction Frege made between sense and reference. How does that fit into Evans's argument?
Oh, Frege's distinction is absolutely crucial to Evans's work. Remember, Frege pointed out that two expressions can refer to the same thing, so they have the same reference but have different senses, and that difference in sense really affects how we understand them.
Right. So like the morning star and the evening star, they both refer to Venus, but they evoke different, connotations or ways of thinking about it.
A perfect example. Both refer to Venus, same reference, but their senses are different. One evokes the image of Venus appearing in the morning, the other in the evening.
Ah, so the way we understand each expression is shaped by its sense, even if they ultimately point to the same object.
Precisely. And Evans takes this insight and runs with it. He argues that to really grasp how language refers, We need to understand not just the connection to the object in the world, but also how we as speakers understand these expressions.
So it's not just about the object itself, but also about our cognitive grasp of it.
And this becomes especially important, like you said, when we start dealing with things like empty names and truth. How does Evans approach these tricky concepts?
Yeah, I was wondering about that, because if reference is so multifaceted, as Evans argues, how do we make sense of expressions that don't seem to refer to anything at all?
He dives right into the problem of empty names. You know, those names that don't actually refer to anything that exists.
Like Santa Claus or unicorn.
The traditional view is that these empty names simply lack sense or meaning because there's no real object for them to latch onto.
Right, so it's like they're just meaningless utterances.
But Evans pushes back against this. He suggests that even sentences containing empty names can still be true. And this really starts to mess with how we think about classical logic.
Wait, so how can a sentence with an empty name be true? That seems counterintuitive.
Let's consider the sentence. Santa Claus lives at the North Pole. Now, we know Santa Claus doesn't exist, but that sentence can still be true in certain contexts, like in a story or child's imagination.
Ah, so the truth of the sentence hinges on the context in which it's spoken.
Precisely. Evans is arguing that context and speaker intention matter a lot when evaluating the truth of sentences containing empty names. It's not simply about whether the name corresponds to a real object out there in the world.
So it challenges that traditional view that all meaningful language must have a direct connection to something that exists.
It definitely does. And this is where Evans's exploration of Russellian and non-Russellian thoughts comes in.
Okay, so I'm guessing these are different ways of thinking about objects. Can you explain those a bit for our listeners?
Sure. Russellian thoughts, as Evans defines them, are thoughts that can't exist without the object they're about. This ties into what's known as Russell's principle, the idea that to think about an object, you have to know which object you're thinking about.
So if I'm thinking about the Eiffel Tower, I need to be able to distinguish it from, say, the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
But Evans, building on Kripke's work, challenges this principle. He suggests that we can refer to and think about things that we can't readily distinguish from others.
Can you give me an example of that?
Think about historical figures you've never met, or, celestial objects you've only read about. Can we really have a thought about something if we can't pick it out from a lineup, so to speak?
That's an interesting point. It seems like Evans is suggesting that there are cases where our thoughts can grasp a concept, even if we lack complete knowledge or direct experience of the object itself.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this leads him to his distinction between fundamental and non-fundamental ideas of objects.
I'm curious to hear more about that. Can you elaborate on that distinction?
Of course. Fundamental ideas are those basic ways we identify objects, often through direct perception. Like seeing a tree right in front of you, that would be a fundamental idea of that tree. But then there are non-fundamental ideas that rely on prior knowledge or connections, like descriptions or causal chains.
So knowing that, say, George Washington was the first president of the United States would be a non-fundamental idea because it relies on historical knowledge and not on me actually, like, meeting George Washington.
Exactly. And a crucial part of having a concept of something, according to Evans, is this understanding of what it means for any object to have that property. He calls this the generality constraint.
So, to use a simple example, if I understand the concept of red, I should be able to apply that to any red object, not just a particular red apple I'm looking at.
Precisely. And this constraint really comes into play when Evans analyzes how we form ideas about objects, especially when those ideas are non-fundamental.
This all ties back to the idea that understanding language is not just about decoding words in isolation. It's about grasping this whole web of knowledge, experience, and cognitive processes that give those words meaning.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the rich interplay between language, thought, and the world we inhabit. And that's what makes Evans's work so insightful and groundbreaking.
It's fascinating how Evans takes these really abstract philosophical ideas and grounds them in this way that makes them relevant to how we actually use language every day.
He really has a knack for that, connecting these complex philosophical notions to the way we speak and think.
And I think that's one of the things that makes his work so engaging. So beyond exploring these different types of reference, Evans also delves into specific modes of identification, right? One that stood out to me was his discussion of demonstrative identification, and specifically this idea of information links.
Yeah, demonstrative identification is key to how we connect language to particular objects in the world. It involves using expressions like this or that to pick out a specific thing.
So like if I point to a cat and say, that cat is fluffy, I'm using demonstrative identification to link my words to that specific cat.
And Evans argues that this connection isn't direct. It's mediated by what he calls information links. These links provide us with information about the object, which helps us identify it and think about it.
Okay, so what kind of information do these links actually provide?
Well, Evans outlines 3 key functions of information links in demonstrative thought. First, they provide a governing conception of the object, like a general understanding of what kind of thing it is. Second, they help us maintain contact with the object, even when it's not directly in our perception. And third, they help us locate it in space.
So these links aren't just static connections. They're more like dynamic processes that guide our understanding and our interaction with the object.
Exactly. They provide a constant flow of information that informs and shapes our thoughts about the object we're referring to.
This brings us to a really interesting comparison, I think, between demonstrative thoughts about objects, like using this, versus thoughts about locations, like using here.
Yeah, that's a key distinction that Evans explores. He argues that this thoughts and here thoughts differ in their dependence on perceptual information and the way those information links function.
So could you break down those differences a bit? I'm curious to hear more.
Sure. As we've been discussing, this thoughts really rely on our ability to perceive and locate an object in space. To think of something as this, we need to have some sort of sensory contact with it. We need to be able to place it within our spatial awareness.
So if I'm in a dark room and hear a noise, I might think, there's something making a noise over there, but I couldn't really think of it as this thing making the noise until I could see it, or at least pinpoint where the sound is coming from.
Precisely. Here thoughts, on the other hand, are even more directly tied to our immediate perception of space. They're grounded in what Evans calls egocentric space, which is our subjective experience of where we are in the world.
So here is always where I am, no matter my actual location in the objective world.
That's right. But Evans doesn't stop there. He argues that our ability to think about locations goes beyond this egocentric perspective. We also have a concept of public space, which is the objective spatial world that exists independently of our immediate perception.
And that's where our ability to connect that immediate here to this larger spatial framework becomes crucial.
Absolutely. Our capacity to connect here to public space lets us form these more comprehensive ideas about locations, about places and their relationships to one another.
So I might think, I'm here in my living room, but I also understand that my living room is part of my house, which is on a street, in a city, and so on.
This connection between our egocentric space and public space is fundamental to how we understand and navigate the world around us.
It's like we have a mental map that allows us to locate ourselves and other things within this larger spatial system.
And this ability to move between these different spatial perspectives is really key to Evans's analysis of how we think about both objects and locations.
It's clear that Evans is really pushing us to think beyond those more traditional, simplistic notions of reference. His work really delves into those cognitive processes, the mechanisms behind how we connect language to the world.
He's not content with just surface-level explanations, right? He wants to get to the heart of how our minds work, how we make sense of things.
And one of the most fascinating areas he explores is this idea of first-person perspective, this really unique nature of I thoughts.
Yeah. Evans's account of I thoughts is one of the most insightful and thought-provoking parts of the book. He's really getting at the core of self-consciousness and how we refer to ourselves.
And it's that concept of immunity to error through misidentification when it comes to I thoughts that I find so intriguing. It seems like he's saying there's a fundamental certainty in how we refer to ourselves.
Evans argues that there are certain judgments about ourselves that we can't be wrong about, judgments that are immune to these mistakes about which object is involved. We might get a lot of things wrong, but we can't be mistaken about the fact that we are the ones having a particular experience.
So if I'm feeling pain in my leg, I might misidentify which leg is actually hurting. But I can't be wrong about the fact that it's me who's experiencing the pain.
This immunity to error stems from the unique way we gain knowledge about ourselves. Unlike our knowledge of external objects, which often relies on perception and inference, figuring things out, our knowledge of our own experiences is direct and immediate.
It's like we have this special, privileged access to our own internal states.
And this has really profound implications for understanding the nature of self-consciousness and the mind-body relationship.
This all connects back, of course, to Evans's broader point about the varieties of reference. He's showing us that even something as fundamental as self-reference has its own unique characteristics, its own set of complexities.
Right. He's constantly reminding us that there's no single, simple explanation for how language refers. Each type of reference, from demonstratives to self-reference, has its own nuances and wrinkles.
And that's what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. He's not trying to simplify or reduce these complex phenomena. Instead, he's embracing the diversity and richness of how language operates.
Absolutely. His work is a call to really appreciate this multifaceted nature of reference, to recognize that our linguistic abilities are far more intricate than we might realize at first glance.
And one thing that really stood out to me was this idea of how I thoughts evolve over time. How does Evans account for this persistence of our sense of self, even as we go through so much change?
Yeah, that's a key question he tackles. He dives into what he calls the cognitive dynamics of I ideas, exploring how our beliefs about ourselves persist and change over time.
It's amazing how we maintain a sense of self-continuity even as we age, change our beliefs, go through all these life experiences.
Right. And Evans argues that I thoughts evolve in this unique way that doesn't require constant re-identification. Unlike our thoughts about, say, changing locations or times, which we have to update based on new information, our I thoughts have this inherent persistence.
So I don't need to, reconfirm every moment that I'm still me, even though my thoughts, feelings, and experiences are constantly shifting.
There's a built-in continuity to our ideas that transcends the flow of our experiences.
This makes me think about the role of memory in all of this. Our ability to recall past experiences must play a role in how we understand who we are.
You're right on the mark. And Evans gets into this directly when he discusses recognition-based identification.
Oh, interesting. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Recognition-based identification is the idea that our ability to recognize specific individuals, including ourselves, really plays a crucial role in our thoughts about them. It relies on memory, past encounters, and this capacity to differentiate between individuals.
So when I see a friend I haven't seen in years, my ability to recognize them as that specific friend is essential to my thoughts about them.
Precisely. And this applies to self-recognition too, of course. Our memories and past experiences contribute to our ability to recognize ourselves as the same individual over time.
But what about those cases where our ability to recognize someone isn't perfect? Like when we encounter people who look very similar, or if our memories are a bit fuzzy.
That's a really important challenge that Evans explores. He acknowledges that our ability to recognize individuals isn't flawless. We can mistake one person for another, or our memories can be faulty.
So does that mean our thoughts about those individuals are somehow flawed or inaccurate then?
That's a complex question. Evans grapples with the potential for error in recognition-based identification, but he suggests that even in cases of misidentification, our thoughts can still be meaningful. They can still refer.
So even if I mistake one twin for the other, it doesn't necessarily mean my thoughts about that person are invalid. My thoughts are still directed toward an individual, even if I haven't correctly identified them.
That's a good way to think about it. Evans's analysis highlights this intricate interplay between recognition, memory, and how we conceive of individuals. It's not always a simple case of perfect identification.
This whole discussion of I thoughts and recognition really underscores this deeply personal, subjective dimension of reference.
Absolutely. It shows that reference isn't just about objective facts about the world out there. It's also about our own unique experiences, memories, and cognitive processes.
But Evans doesn't stop there, does he? He goes on to explore the social dimensions of reference, too, emphasizing the role of communication and shared practices.
Right. He recognizes that language isn't just a solitary activity, it's something we do together. It's a social tool we use to share information, to coordinate our actions, to build relationships.
So how does our interaction with others affect the way language refers then?
Evans introduces this concept of the information-invoking use of expressions. This is where speakers intentionally use language to guide listeners to connect with the referent they have in mind.
So it's not just about uttering words, it's about using language strategically to direct attention and share information with someone else.
And for this kind of communication to work, especially when using these information-invoking expressions, there needs to be some common ground, a background of shared information between the speaker and the listener.
It's like we're always drawing on this shared pool of knowledge and assumptions when we're talking to each other.
Precisely. And that shared background is crucial for understanding how we navigate the complexities of reference, especially when dealing with expressions that might not have a clear, real-world counterpart.
Like the whole issue of negative existential statements.
Evans doesn't shy away from that tricky philosophical terrain. He explores how we make sense of statements about things that don't exist, like fictional characters or hypothetical scenarios.
It's interesting how we can talk about things that don't have a real-world referent in such a natural way.
Right. And Evans offers this compelling analysis using these concepts of really and make-believe. He argues that negative existential statements function within a framework of pretense and shared understanding.
So when we talk about Santa Claus or unicorns, we're engaging in this kind of make-believe. We're suspending our disbelief and operating within a shared fictional context.
And this highlights this really dynamic interplay between language, thought, and the social context in which we use language to communicate.
It almost feels like Evans is suggesting that the way we grasp reality itself is filtered through this lens of language.
That's a really sharp observation. Evans argues that how we refer to things, the categories we use, the distinctions we make, all these structures of language, they really shape how we understand what exists and how it all hangs together.
So different languages, with their own unique systems of reference, could potentially lead to different ways of understanding reality.
It's a possibility that Evans is definitely open to. He doesn't shy away from this idea of linguistic relativity, the idea that language can influence our thought processes.
This raises some fascinating questions, then, about the connection between language and culture. If our language shapes how we think, then our cultural worldviews must be deeply intertwined with our linguistic practices.
Absolutely. Evans's work encourages us to think about these connections, to view language not just as a tool for communication, but as something more fundamental to how we make sense of the world.
This makes me think about the limits of language, though.
hmm
If our understanding of reality is so tied to these linguistic frameworks, are there aspects of reality that language just can't quite capture?
That is a huge question, and it's one that philosophers have been debating for centuries. Evans doesn't claim to have all the answers, but his work certainly prompts us to consider the inherent limitations of our linguistic systems.
It's a good reminder that our concepts, our categories, the ways we describe the world, they're all ultimately provisional. They're always open to change and revision.
Exactly. There's this inherent humility in Evans's approach. He recognizes the incredible power of language, but also its limits. He's not suggesting that language can perfectly map onto reality.
This deep dive into the varieties of reference has been a real eye-opener for me. It's made me think so much more critically about how language works, how it influences our thoughts, how it connects us to the world.
Evans's work really is groundbreaking. It pushes us beyond those simplistic one-size-fits-all explanations of reference and helps us see the true complexity and richness of how language actually functions.
And by challenging our assumptions about reference, it opens up all these new avenues for understanding not just language itself, but our relationship to the world around us.
Absolutely. It encourages us to keep asking these big questions about language, thought, and reality, and to keep exploring the intricate ways in which they're all intertwined.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up our deep dive into the varieties of reference. It's been a dense but incredibly rewarding journey.
I couldn't agree more. Evans's book is a must-read for anyone who wants to grapple with these fundamental questions about how we think and communicate.
And to our listeners, if language is so multifaceted in how it connects to the world, as we've explored today, what implications does that have for our own understanding of reality? That's something we'll leave you to ponder. We hope you've enjoyed our exploration of Evans' work, and we encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep engaging with these fascinating philosophical ideas. Until next time.